start into. Yeah, we are discussing tonight the fourth part of There Never Was a West by David Graeber. And well, this is one of the pieces where David does the thing I love the most in him. That is, he never gives directions, but he always shows you where to look and gives you perspective and new ways to look at things you thought you knew. And there never was a West is a text about democracy and how important is to us to think about democracy and to have tools to think about it. And he doesn't give us directions about what democracy should be or is supposed to be, but he dismantles our myths about the origins of democracy and where to look if we want to understand what democracy is. This part of There Never Was a West is particularly interesting and important from this point of view. Here he says, first, democracy as we think of today is not something that has to be retrieved in ancient Greece or wherever. It only emerges in the our ideas, contemporary ideas and values only emerge in the late North Atlantic world system, in centers of empire like England and France, or colonies like the United States, not because these places were the West, but because they were places where these ideas coalesced after having been formed in interactions and in spaces born out of the emergence of capitalism and out of the tabula rasa that capitalism made of other civilizations. So when at the start of this chapter, David says, so I have a reaction. He says, really, democracy only emerges within centers of empire like England and France and colonies like the United States, after the Atlantic system had existed for almost 300 years. I say, okay, what about Italian commons? But actually, he's speaking about contemporary ideas of freedom, democracy, and contemporary values. And this system of values only emerges from, as we will see in this chapter, pirates, the encounter with Native Americans, and from the spaces in the between, as he calls it, them in spaces in the between that happened in the formation of the North Atlantic world system. In showing us where to look for the origins of modern democracy, he points out a very important difference between written history and what we could call hidden history. I've been reading in these days an amazing article by Nicholas Smaligo these days about Walter Benjamin and the dawn of everything. Smaligo points out how David and Wengrow do what Walter Benjamin urged to do, to point out the history of the oppressed. This history is not something you can retrieve in texts or in books. And when we look for democracy for the origins of democracy in books, we are looking in the wrong place. We are looking in a tradition that until the 19th century has been against democracy, and we gain a distorted translation of our ideas, distorted because when these ideas that form in the spaces in the between are expressed inside written tradition, inside the frame of the state and of the literary and philosophical tradition, they are abstractified. They are spoiled of their complexity and of their very origins. They are so deformed that we can now think that democracy is the competitive politics that we have in elections. I would like to read a page that is, in my opinion, the core of the whole text. It's in the book. It's page 349, and in this page, David says the ideas that Huntington, the values that Huntington attributes to Western civilization were actually thought as a matter of fact in the Muslim trading ecumene of the Indian Ocean. I'm reading just the first paragraph of page 349. In the Muslim trading ecumene of the Indian Ocean, some of Huntington's values, a certain notion of liberty, a certain notion of equality, some very explicit ideas about freedom of trade and the rule of law, had long been considered important. Others, such as religious tolerance, might well have become values as a result of Europeans coming into the scene. And this is a conscious refusal of European intolerance that comes up, if only by point of contrast. My real point, says David in Possibilities, is that one simply cannot lay any of these values down to one particular moral, intellectual, or cultural tradition. They arise, for better or worse, from exactly this sort of interaction. I also want to make another point too. We are dealing with the work of a Muslim jurist writing a book addressed to a South Indian king. The values of tolerance and mutual accommodation he wishes to defend actually, these are our terms, he himself speaks of kindness, might have emerged from a complex intercultural space outside the authority of any overarching state power, and they might have only crystallized as values in the face of those who wished to destroy this space. Yet, in order to write about them, to justify their defense, he was forced to deal with states and frame his argument in terms of a single literary philosophical tradition, in this case, the legal tradition of Sunni Islam. There was an act of reincorporation. There inevitably must be once one re-enters the world of state power and textual authority. And when later authors write about such ideas, they tend to represent matters as if the ideals emerged from that tradition, as if the ideals emerged from that tradition, rather than from the spaces in the between. So do historians. In a way, it's almost inevitable that they should do so, considering the nature of their source material. They are, after all, primarily students of textual tradition, and the information about the spaces in the between is often very difficult to come by. What's more, they are writing in large part within the same literary tradition as their sources. This is what makes the real origins of democratic ideals so difficult to reconstruct. Even I skipped some lines. Even people that were part Native Americans or part Chinese, or who had never set foot in Europe, when it came time to write about their experiences about democracy, they would become featherless abstractions. When it came time to write institutional histories, they referred back almost invariably to the classical world. After this page, David goes on describing the influence debate that had took place in the USA in the 70s, and the influence debate was about an Iraqi historian suggesting that some ideas of European USA democracy were born out of the influence of the Six Nations traditions. That is, as all of us know, something very important in the dawn of everything. What's interesting is that there was an virulent reaction against this proposal, and the reaction was about the fact that there is no reference in the constitutionalist, in the Federalist Papers or in constitutionalist debates, no reference to Native Indians' ways or traditions. But actually, it would be strange if there were such a reference, because those writing the Federalist Papers were not for democracy, and were not the kind of people that would support democracy. Democracy, as we think about today, was some way forced into Western ideals by the fact that people supported it. And the kind of people John Adams and the other Federalists were totally against. So we are, says David, we are searching for the origins of democracy, precisely where they are least likely, where we are least likely to find it, in the proper proclamations of the states that largely suppressed local forms of self-governance and collective deliberation, and the literary philosophical tradition that justified the states in doing so. If we really want to understand, to have tools to think of democracy and of self-governing communities, we must not look at those literary traditions justifying the suppression of democracy. We must instead look at the hidden tradition, at what is difficult to see. David says, if I cannot prove that Native Americans had an influence on the USA Constitution, but the very point is, if there was such an influence, it would be very unlikely that we have traces of it. The problem is always the translation in terms of the state and of the literary tradition that is about suppressing this kind of self-governance.
Just a comment, like, it's interesting to me that that is a story that we've finished the Dawn of Everything, and that story seems very familiar, but he's been writing, I thought, oh, that's familiar because he's got it in the Democracy Project, which was published in 2013. But this was published in 2017, and he's kind of talking about some of the themes that are coming out in the Dawn of Everything as early as this. And I don't know, it was published in 2007, so I don't know whether it was originally an article before that or if it was first published in this. Does anyone know?
It was, as far as I know, speech presented at the conference on cosmopolitanism in 2006. I think he worked on these ideas very, very often, and yes, of course, they come in the Democracy Project and in Pirates, of course. I don't know, and I don't know if we can actually know where they emerged first, and I'm not sure it's so important. As what I've seen in reading David's works is that he sort of rehearsed ideas many times in many texts with developments on them, and but still, as far as I know, Possibilities is a sort of like Fragments, a sort of a preliminary manifesto. It contains in Nuce, in
new terms.
No, it's Latin. It contains in everything he said later is in some sort already in Possibilities. Is maybe not everything, but most of his thought is already there, and then there are developments.
Yeah, I totally agree that the big ideas are out there and they've been sort of realized in Dawn of Everything. So there's this really, I think, discernible progression where you can see he's putting together some of these ideas about indigenous confederation and how confederation, the space between confederation and authority, you know, right there is the I don't even know the words for it, but it's like it's the magical property, it's the fetishistic social obligation. It's the kind of closest I've seen to come at it, where like, well, or to use, I mean, Vasily's not here, so he'd be right there. He'd be all over this. He'd be saying gift, mouse, this is the Mosian sort of that magical kind of relationship where when you extend debt, there's this implication of obligation. It's not necessarily there, but yeah. So, and that's what I love about the spaces between, because it's like democracy happens in the space between authority. So it's almost like the truest democrats, the actual creative refusers, are right there present to sort of like do what David did, which was like sort of like toss those balls up into the air and get them kind of juggling and improvisatory and spontaneous, but where it's collective. And so it's not the voluntary act of the deed, Leninist, vanguard, wrong, but it's the collective expression of the I guess, well, this is where Simona will come in. I don't know what Spinoza would have called it. I don't think Hegel would have called it zeitgeist. So I mean, I honestly don't know my continental philosophy history well enough. Most would call it how, but that spirit of collective energy that comes in and is still improvisatory, but where there's the ability for consent. I pause.
May I comment, or yeah, I'm not sure I can find the quote right now, the citation right now, but somewhere in the Never Was a West, Graeber says it's because historians erase the infinite entanglements that gave birth to ideas, that they have to recur to the myth of the great man and of the so that they erase the collective creation. Yeah, it's absolutely Walter Benjamin. I'll look for the citation.
Yeah, that. Thank you. So a little backstory. I'm a little bit on fire because I'm in the midst of writing some stuff that is about how the collective revolution, the collective energy of the revolution, and by that I mean the revolutionary tradition that goes back to Glorious Revolution, 1688, liberalism, how that allows for privatization, because there's an arrogation of private actors that can kind of happen, that if that is not revealed in that, you know, Benjaminian kind of way, is forever lost. And that's where the possibility lies. I pause.
Yeah, I cannot find the quote, but I would like, if you don't mind, to read another passage from page 355. Democratic innovation and democratic values have a tendency to spring from what I've called zones of cultural improvisation, usually also outside of the control of states, and from frontier communities such as Madagascar or medieval Iceland or Indian Ocean. All of this has very little to do with the great literary philosophical tradition that tend to be seen as the pillars of great civilization. Indeed, with few exceptions, those traditions are overall explicitly hostile to democratic procedures and the sort of people that employ them. At a certain point, however, first in the core states of the Atlantic system, notably England and France, this began to change. The creation of that system had been heralded by such an unprecedented destruction that it allowed endless new improvisational space for the emerging of Atlantic proletariat. States, under pressure of social movements, began to institute reforms. Eventually, those working in the elite's literary tradition started seeking precedents for them. This process of democratic recuperation and refoundation was typical of a broader process that probably marks any civilizational tradition, but was at that time entering a phase of critical intensity. As European states expanded and the Atlantic system came in to encompass the whole world, all sorts of global influences appear to have coalesced in European capitals and to have been reabsorbed within the tradition that eventually came to be known as Western. The actual genealogy of the elements that came together in the modern states, for example, is probably impossible to reconstruct, if only because the very process of recuperation tends to scrub away the more exotic elements in written account, or if not, integrate them into familiar topoi of invention and discovery. This is the text. I repeat, integrate them into familiar topoi of invention and discovery. Historians who tend to rely almost exclusively on text and pride themselves on exacting standards of evidence, therefore, often end up, as they did with the Iroquois influence theory, feeling it is their professional responsibility to act as if new ideas do emerge from within textual tradition. And also, yes, this is reincorporating into textual tradition, putting out the myth of invention and discovery from one great man written in the great texts of tradition. And it's also the idea that it is impossible to reconstruct how it really went on, but we can guess what happened in Madagascar, in pirates, in frontiers, in the Indian Ocean markets. And the following page is right about fetishism, and it's very interesting. It's fetishism and its connection to our state of nature ideas and to our jus naturalism. I forgot the English terms. Our ideas about natural law and contracts and rights and justice as contracts come from fetishism, from African fetishism. And it's fascinating, totally fascinating. And it works. And I think it would probably have ended up in the volume of The Dawn of Everything series about Africa. But it's really amazing. You're muted, Stephen. But I quiet now.
Oh yeah, boy, you totally animated me. Where you concluded about the fetish, you know, David wrote extensively about the 3 articles by William Peets on the fetish, which I think are still, well, he would say, let me go to the best authority. He would say are the 3 finest articles ever written on that relationship between objects having this supernatural power. And so, you know, if we think of just contemporary, okay, if we think of contemporary society where we are so beyond supernatural thought, like we would never subscribe to anything supernatural. And yet there's this document that has some words on it that have fetishistic power, that if we don't subscribe to those words, we cannot abide righteously. And we are going outside of some kind of sovereignty that here's where things get troubling. Right, because Hobbes' sovereignty is totally a fetish.
I just want to jump in and say like the word fetish is kind of a funny word because it has been taken into, I don't know what the original etymology was. I should, because I've read a bunch of this stuff. But like, I mean, originally for them, it was a religious item that you make a swear. So basically, this is just in order to do a contractual relationship, a commercial relationship, people are going to say, well, how do I know you're going to hold your contract? Oh, well, I swear. Just as in the same way, you would have a fetish, you would say, I swear upon the Bible. You know, I make an oath, I swear on the Bible. And so the word fetish, because it's African, gets
no, but it's not. It's Latin. It's Latin. It's Latin.
But it's describing, it's a Latin word describing this African relationship, which is just simply
right
imbued with magic power. When
yes.
I think you could
yes.
think about it very simply. But what I do agree is the idea that then that contract that you're making as a social relationship, it doesn't appear to have violence in it. Whereas Hobbes and the liberal order want a state to protect violence. And this is that kind of move away from democracy into using violence, the thing. So that kind of Hobbes sovereign is definitely a fetish. But I mean, this is what I would ask, is this quote unquote, fetish, it's basically an oath to do commercial activity. Was there any violence to demand like a rule of law, other than you're supposed to be an honorable person and only do business with people who are going to fulfill their oath?
Okay, so that's where I would love help, because that's precisely the thing I'm trying to
Simona, comment on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was about to come in. Well, actually, Hobbes is finite, and that it's not just violence, and he's relying on the jus naturalis tradition, on the jus naturalism tradition. His sovereign is a fetish in all the senses of it, in the sense, meaning that there is a paradox in sovereignty, as Agamben points out very well, and it is related to the sacred, just as a fetish is. The sovereign is the foundation of law, because he is outside the law. The only possible foundation for the system is outside the system. So the sovereign is the one that guarantees the whole social contract. And
yeah, the contract is written by.
Yeah. No, the social contract, the basic in jus naturalis theory, there are two fundamental political contracts, that is pactum unionis and pactum subjectionis. That is a contract by which I unite with other fellow humans to form a society, and another contract, social contract, by which I or we all of us together agree to be subject to one single power. The whole jus naturalistic debate is on the relationships between those two pacts. Actually, in Spinoza, there is just the pactum unionis. He puts things in such a way that pactum subjectionis, that is the promise to obey, to be subject to one power, is simply nullified by the fact that you can disobey whenever you want by your natural right. And that's why Hobbesian tradition and Carl Smith hate Spinoza more than anything else. As Schmidt points out, and actually Agamben takes everything from Carl Schmitt, to have the state as a rational construct, you have as a crystal, says Schmidt, you have to you need a transcendent power. You need somebody, a subject that is outside the system, that founds it. Agamben says this outside is the sacer, il sacro, the sacred. And so going back to fetishes, it is the overall scheme of having a contract that is guaranteed by a sacred power like that of the fetish, that is had been developed by African merchants, and it is this scheme of thought that is taken in by Jewish naturalism and perfectioned by Hobbes by saying we all put all of our power in a transcendent thing that is the monarch. That in for Hobbes is a person, but the problem with an individual person is that it's it cannot be totally immaterial, totally outside the system. So modern times political theory puts this sovereign in this kind of sovereignty in the constitution, or in this abstract thing that is the people. And the fifth part of There Never Was a West is a very compelling criticism of this abstract sovereign that is the people. Idealizing the people is another way to put the sovereign outside the system in order for the system to work, just to exist, to have a system of laws, a legal system that is coherent and crystal in Carl Schmitt's hopes, and has and that founds the legitimacy of violence. You need to put the sovereign and the violence that is the actual foundation for the system outside of the system. You must pretend that there is no violence at the foundation, but just a fetish. So I don't know if I was too confused or if I. Okay, that's
No, very
so like
clear.
the
It's very clear.
idea of democracy is a sort of fetish that is written to the Greek history rather than the type of actual democracy that, yeah, when people are just like, well, we need to cooperate, so let's work together in small communities, and then if they have to, somebody comes in and threatens them, they have to somebody has to write down and justify a history of democracy. They have to.
No, actually, the fetish would be the idea, the people, that as a substitute for the monarch. So in
I think it's this essay that talks about all the court cases where you have the people versus, and it's always, the people are the government. I mean, like, oh no, they're not.
The people
that's
doesn't exist. It's a fetish.
Yeah, the same. Yeah, like
Yeah.
they said, who are these people and who decided to
Yeah.
on their behalf? Exactly. But then I don't understand, like he's talking about this 5-nation confederacy, and it is some space in between that is also sacred, that they created in order to come together and to make a consensus in between all of these groups. And how would you describe this space, and how, because they don't talk about in their case about democracy, people, monarchy, or any fetishism, but then this space in between this 5 nations or any other complicated arrangement is requires something outside of just simple consensus between actual people who are sitting together and making decisions.
No, it's two different things. In this paper, David doesn't dive into confederations or actual organizations of collective decision making. The spaces in the between are the spaces out of the radar, so to say, or spaces where people are obliged to figure out ways to live together outside the rule of law, outside a state power that enforces contracts outside the law. And David thesis is that it is in such spaces of experimentation, of people trying to figure out how to live together, that democracy emerges. This is fetishism in African markets was one of the ways to they figured out about how to guarantee contracts. The problem with contracts is that is game theory. If you don't, if you can make a deal and then there is nothing that obliges you to stay to your word, to be obliging to what you agreed on, you can just come out doing whatever you want. You can sell the Cappella Sistina, take the money, and then the buyer cannot enforce his contract. So fetishes were a way to guarantee contracts. There is a sacred thing that will cause you harm if you don't respect what you agreed on. The Hobbesian sovereign and the modern state as is a fetish in as much it is a guarantee that contracts will be respected, because there is a force that will enforce them. And this force is on one side very material, because it's the violence of police enforcing the contract. But on the other side, it's a fetish. It relies on the imaginary side. It's
Yeah.
We all believe in the state.
Yeah. Let me interrupt you. I just want to tell a story that David and I went to the Anthropological Museum in Berlin, and they have this exposition of the exactly like African fetishist figures, where you put in needles. If it was, I think it was mostly about marriage contracts. So if somebody don't do, like, don't raise the kids or run away, or was like, infidelity, so they would just somehow like, make this little statues of the person that did bad, and mutilated these little dolls. And yes, true, like we also believe that the state will come and punish the bad people who would do this and that, but we also know that state does not necessarily punish all the bad people, but doing it in like some kind of a strange way, sometimes punish, sometimes not, very much the same as people get sick and then they can think, oh, it's because somebody did this to my doll, or and I did bad things. So that's understandable. So my question was not about that, and it's clearly that you're right, and it's really amazing actually if the people will understand that how much the society we're living in is similar to some kind of beliefs in African markets. But my question was about more complex social organization, and I think David talking about that in this text. I cannot recall where exactly, about these 5 nations. So, and he definitely talking how the state reveal our current system, revealed its incapability to deal or contradiction, internal contradictions, when globalization started. And then we need to create organizations that is beyond national state. And then we cannot pretend anymore that they're democratic, because clearly there is no democracy in United Nations or somewhere else. So how this other more complex space constituted, when you don't deal with spaces in between of social state and social violence, but you have it like direct democracy and consensus processes, but then you have other communities here and there, and they all have to come together. That's and that's what the fifth nations did, and that's how what is influenced in the American Constitution originally. Yeah, like that's why all these crazy Europeans who were killing each other hundreds of years and came to America, and then suddenly just have an idea that maybe they need to have a federal structure. French didn't do that. They keep the vertical structure. Only Americans did, like in some way. So what is that? How this space is organized?
Oh, I have no idea how. But I think
I could just comment just briefly on that. But like, I mean, the 5 nations were an agreement to prevent them from going to war, because they basically, that was destructive and it killed all kinds of people. And I would imagine, particularly the strength of the women's communities, women's longhouses within the 5 nations would have been that kind of constituting process. And then basically, when people are in an argument, they refer back to the rules. Well, we've got this constitution that prevents people from doing this, and those constitutional rules were set up to kind of push them back into a balance where there's an opportunity for these conversations that are more peacemaker conversations. And not entirely, there's obviously lots of men who do peace work, but I think a lot of that would have been women doing peace work. And so the Europeans encounter this idea that these 5 nations have a constitution that enables them to not to make decisions and not fight, and it creates a certain amount of strength that everybody can agree and has a negotiating power, because when you're negotiating, anybody can say, well, I'm part of this, I'm part of a democracy. That has a big influence on the debates in Europe. So that maybe the space in between is that my kind of suggestion is the women's negotiating power to prevent war, including also men who are peace negotiators as well. It's not specifically gender, but much more, probably much more so. I would love to hear like John, Madeline, Max, what any kind of comments you had on the article.
I'm just trying to keep up with the conversation. Thank you for letting me listen in. Yeah, I don't know. There's so much that has been interesting in this article. Something when I first started reading this article, it reminded me of another article that I'd read. By an Iranian studies professor called about against Samuel Huntington also, and I think the article was called like for the last time civilizations. So he was arguing against the concept of civilizations, and I think the concept what stood out to me is this concept that I think he took from Edward Said called like contrapunctual cultural evolution. So like one group would create some or inherit some like cultural practice, and then they would like modify it a little bit, and then another group would sort of do the same thing, and that's how human history has sort of developed. But just one of the many things I was thinking about is that in this article, it's almost it goes even more deeper than that, because I feel like that view is a very sort of state-based view where like one organized group of people inherit something, but this different view that in this article is that like in between those actual groups that are sort of carrying the mantle and creating the textual traditions, that's where things are happening. And it's actually makes a ton of sense. It's basically people are in a context in which they must act in a sort of consensus democratic way. So yeah, I'm just chewing on this sort of thing. It's a very simple idea, but it's sort of caused an earthquake in my preconceived notions. So yeah.
Thank you, John. I'd just like to say a little something. There seems to be all these the social relationships that are sort of forcing people to cooperate. I don't know, the scary thing seems to be that they happen in retaliation to domination. And I find that, you know, the people, yeah, I don't know, it's scary that because of this kind of crisis of needing to work together, that we have to look after each other. And I find, I don't know, unless there's a danger, humans tend to just kind of wait before it's too late. And it's yeah, I don't know. What page was I looking at? It's graphic. I kind of lost myself, to be honest. But yeah, that's sort of, I think I was listening to, was it someone, Kelly? Is that someone? I was watching one of the pirate videos the other day, and how she mentioned something I couldn't really get, but it was talking about how governance through crisis, and how the government kind of makes these decisions because of the crisis, and we kind of, everyone's in such a confusion, but it seems like it can work for I don't know, for people and communities when there is a crisis to work together. But it's about, yeah, I don't know, I'm lost, but yeah, there's that kind of, yeah. Sorry, yes, I'm all over the place.
No, you're absolutely right. When there's a crisis, what sort of the anarchist tradition has proved is when people need to organize themselves, they do. And so the classic example that I know best is Mexico City in 1985 in the earthquake. But it's just one of many examples. Spain, Barcelona in 1935, where people organize themselves to sort of, resist authoritarian structures. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah. But it's almost the government is kind of becoming like an equation now. You have this crisis and decisions are made that kind of people have to just kind of go along. Well, yeah, I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think you're onto something that the Museum of Care has kind of talked about, that I know Nika has referred to and that David talked about, and that's AI, artificial intelligence, where there are these kind of, well, I mean, according to capitalism, inevitable crises that then require spontaneous automatic self-organization that precedes state forms. And so that's the very contradiction of the kind of bourgeois system of private ownership that we have, where we would expect owners to be the first ones out there. But really, owners, they put their employees out there first, because that's what risk aversion looks like. And so you put them out there first as the sort of cannon fodder, and then you scoop in and you start to constitute what money looks like. And so it's all this kind of, oh wow, I sound really conspiratorial. So I'm gonna pause. But there are dynamics to social relations.
Yeah, but definitely, David, with Mehdi Ben Hassim, they were talking a lot about artificial intelligence as this, kind of a new version of this abstraction that's may replace the sovereign in the years to come, because that's the one that is totally outside, it's kind of like bigger than everyone, and can make this only right decisions in the moment of crisis or in any moment, because they know better, because they are connecting to all this databases of laws and information and so on and so forth.
Exactly, which is the inherent problem of any algorithm, because it ultimately ascribes a numeric value to what is a moral relationship, and that is the ultimate argument of debt. I'm going to put a plug in for the reading group, which we're going to be doing a reading group on. The ultimate fallacy of Bullian or materialist thinking, I say as a materialist, is this idea that there's something outside of us that's more valuable than what's intrinsic. And when we think of the gold standard or any kind of standard, it requires a sacred that is outside, and that's inherently fetishistic. So that's what needs to be unpacked.
And
thank you, Max.
if I can jump in, there is also this idea that in crisis like earthquakes or floods, people start self-organizing, and what happens is that all the superimpositions of hierarchy and state power are broken, so people can self-organize more efficiently. And there is all the theme of stupidity and violence and bureaucracy there. The idea that real efficiency is the baseline communism of self-organization outside the state. So sorry. If nobody wants to say, the other side of emergency is emergency powers. That is dictator. And there is this ambivalence in emergencies because they justify, they are traditionally a justification for dictator powers, for more hard power. And on the other side, they are the opportunity to build something new and more practical, so to say. And the red flag was originally the flag of emergency, of the state of emergency.
Yeah, and it's very interesting how many like left-wing progressive thinkers are now, because of the climate emergency, are saying yes, yes, yes. The only powers that can save the day is the centralized dictatorship powers. So, you know, and it's always praising for China, for example, that is dealing better because they're more efficient, because they're centralized, and that's exactly the powers that will prevail, and so on and so forth. So instead of like dismantling the mythology, we are now in a state when we're embracing that even in a more harsh way. So this criticism of the Western democracy, that's whatever democracy that was kind of built on mythology, where many people are even going to the even more horrifying solution, if it's possible to call it solution. I wouldn't. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the myths David dismantled is exactly the efficiency of dictatorship. It's not efficient, it's stupid. And it's the simple solution that is usually wrong, as in debt exergo.
Yeah, and actually, like one of the biggest projects of David Graeber Institute, supposed to be the brain trust, the reincarnation of the brain trust that David was running for the last year of his life, that's supposed to be concentrating on climate change and solutions for climate change. So yeah, so I think it's an extremely important to merge these practical solutions that we need to, like the steps that we need to take right now to hope to survive or to save at least part of whatever part of the day, some hours maybe, and this obstructions that is coming upon us. But he was always saying that it may come the day when people would say, okay, who can save that? Only like Chinese or American military can, with technological solutions, with technofix, can save the day for climate change. And of course, all of this is really scary because the people are doing stuff they actually never try, and they don't know how it will work out. They put something in the ocean, something in the, you know, air, and then it may work and may not. But we're not voting for that. We just will kind of be exposed to the outcome.
One of the
just comment.
so, Madeleine has not spoken, but is she still there? Yeah. Hi.
I'm thinking I'm coming back to writing, I think, and thinking about this. And David, it talks about the way whenever you're writing, so often you fall back into the Western eye and this objective observer who's trying to solve a problem. And it makes me think too about then what is the role of writing in these spaces in between, and is it the trying to accomplish the unlearning, or like to deconstruct that to then realize something else. But it also makes me think about when he's talking about the spread of these ideas in this global system, that perhaps they're not being transmitted through writing, or not only through writing, they're through word of mouth, but then also texts that maybe people are reading in different ways. I just think that's an interesting part when you're talking about these proclamations, of the state that are suppressing these democratic forces, but people also when writing these histories kind of are using these texts maybe to, can you reveal some of these other democratic forms? We've been thinking about that sort of writing then and today.
Yeah, it's maybe if I can comment on that. Yeah, I think it's yeah, that's the main point. So I think David believed that the revolution is a transformation of the common sense. How can we do that? Basically, it's done through the writings, as we see. So we're exposed to a certain way of truth, and that's how everybody lives. Like that what Stephen proposed for the Fight Club that we develop. Who is this people, Hobbes and Rousseau? Ask somebody in the street, they don't know who is this guys. They may not agree with their ideas, but we all live in a Hobbesian world. So why? Because it's a system that created for everyone this common sense. We're reading, it's in schools and universities and so on. So I think writings is the way to, or not only writings, also any other form of transmittable, performing. Like that's why Zapatistas,
There it is.
yeah, they're all about artistic expression. So they have like Marcos, who is constantly writing books, writing these communiques. They doing these public performances all the time. So and it's really take over the world in a way, in a big way.
Right.
I thought the quote that kind of sums up this that I found is on page 363, and it's actually David Graeber summarizing or quoting another writer, Mignola, and he talks about the Zapatistas, and he says the Zapatistas had to use this word democracy, but of course they're using the word democracy because it's the word that the Americans use about their system, which basically isn't quite very democratic. And so the Zapatistas are bringing democracy from the outside, or from some kind of space that's quite different, but they still have to use the word democracy because that's what everybody understands. So it's quite an interesting moment to hear, democracy being explained to, the Americans in, by people who actually have democracy, but they probably wouldn't normally use that word.
Yeah, and this out of
that quote
Maya
page
traditions.
363.
But this is fifth part. But yes, and these ideas and practices of democracy come out of the Maya tradition that are very well described in the dawn of everything. Yes.
I would suggest somebody is wrap up because we're now 1 hour and a half. That
Yeah.
isn't usually long, but it was very exciting. So maybe, Michael, do you want to give everybody words? So how would we do that?
No, maybe Simona, you want to suggest a wrap up?
Yeah, I
You could
suggest
say
to wrap
something,
up.
or we could get, you can make a
So-
question and everyone can have a short answer.
I have no idea of which question. Maybe you can do that. I would just say our next appointment is supposed to be on the 18th of August, isn't it? Shall we keep this time that is horrible to me because it's dinner time, sacred dinner time during sacred summer holidays in Italy? Or we can go back to 8 London time. So
Yeah, I
no.
think we did it for Vasily, who didn't come
Yeah.
today. So let's move the time.
Yeah, so we move to, okay, thank you very much. So just if you have any comments or ideas to put forward, maybe to think over for the next time, you are welcome. And so thank you very much to everybody. It was really amazing, and the interactions were, the ideas I got from this session were amazing, really. So thank you, everybody. And
Thank you, everyone. See you soon.
thank you.